This is part 3 of cells and their environment, and we've already talked about the cytoskeleton and how the cytoskeleton is involved in migration of cells and cell movement. We're now going to talk about how cells are connected together. And this really relates to how do cells form tissues. Because in order to form tissues and to form organs, and to form multicellular organizations, we need to figure out how cells are actually able to couple to one another, and also how that aids communication. So here we're looking at how cells organize into tissues, and what we're really going to look at is how cells connect to one another, and also to a certain extent how they might connect to basement membranes as well. But we're going to focus on this aspect, how mechanical stresses are transmitted and how things are communicated with each other. In the later part, we'll talk about the extracellular matrix and what's outside the cells and what role that has in forming organs and tissues. So again, the cytoskeleton is vitally important in organizing into tissues. And probably the simplest example here is joining the cytoskeleton of neighboring cells to each other. And this can be done by directly joining the actin filament network, or as often as not, the intermediate filament network between cells that provides both mechanical strength to tissues, but also can aid communication and organ function. So, for example, in cardiac and skeletal muscle, we can get a coordinated form of action or contraction of the muscles, because the actin filaments are aligned in the same direction, and that allows efficient muscle contraction. So this is cardiac muscle cells, where we're seeing in the yellow, that's the actin filaments, and you can see the neighboring cells, the filaments are all aligned together and they actually connect with one another. And it's even more apparent in skeletal muscle, where in fact the cells fuse together to create long multi-nucleate cells. So I don't think you can see here that this is a smooth muscle cell, and you can see several nuclei, which are the darker parts. And you can also see the striated actin filaments. And as the cells fuse together, all those filaments become coordinated together, and that's what allows the skeletal muscles to form powerful contractions across longer distances. The other way that cells can connect together rather than direct fusion, as we've seen in cardiac and skeletal muscle, is that cells actually form a variety of cell-to-cell contacts. So here we have two separate cells, so 1 and 2, and this would be 1 and 2 here. And between the cells and the extracellular space, we can see a number of different types of connective forms that can occur between cells. So we can see the two cells are still separate cells. They've not fused together. There's still this gap in between them. But they can form tight junctions. They can also form desmosomes and also gap junctions. as some of the major ways that they connect to one another. And each of these have slightly different functions, and we'll talk about all of those in turn. Now, the other thing that's important in connecting cells together is that there are molecules that aid this expressed on the surface of cells, and these are called cadherins. And cadherins allow cells that are similar to each other to recognize each other. So imagine it's like a recognition and a little handshake. So if it's the same kind of cell and they want to join together, they join together and start to form that kind of bond. And the interaction of the cadherins forming together leads to cell-to-cell junction formation of those tight junctions, gap junctions, and also the desmosomes, which we're going to talk about. But first of all, there needs to be that kind of recognition before they'll do that. And a similar kind of thing is happening binding to the extracellular matrix as well. So once the cells have recognized each other with the cadherins, they can begin to form the various different junctions. If we think about tight junctions first, by its very name, tight junctions help cells join together very tightly. They can restrict the movement of molecules in that space between cells and even restrict the movement of water as occurs with endothelial cells. So joining cells together tightly can provide mechanical strength to the tissue because it's almost like stitching the two tissues together, but it can also form an impermeable barrier between the cells, as I've already mentioned, and this happens with endothelial cells, particularly in what we call the blood-brain barrier, where it's very difficult for molecules to move across. Now, the proteins in the tight junctions linking to one another, they actually link to the cytoskeleton of each cell. So the tight junction proteins are linked to the actin cytoskeleton, and this is the actin filaments that we're showing here, linked to these tight junctions. Okay, and the way that the tight junctions actually form is through the claudin and occludin proteins, and these kind of, if you like, zipper up and form that tight junction together. So you can see that can really tightly bind cells together. The next kind of connector is what's called desmosomes. And again, the desmosomes are a looser kind of connection. Now this time, instead of connecting via the cells by the actin skeleton, they actually connect to the intermediate filament networks. The other thing about these desmosomes is that the gap between the cells is much wider than tight junctions. So here we have about a 30 nanomolar gap, and you can see under this electron microscope here we have two neighboring cells, 1 and 2. There's that gap in between, and in that gap, that's where we have those cadherin adhesion type proteins, and they're anchored to a dense plaque of anchor proteins, and those anchor proteins themselves are then connected by connector proteins to the intermediate filaments. I'm not going to go into the details of all the different protein types in there, but I hope you can see now there is a connection, but it's a much looser, less rigid connection. It's also going to allow space in between the cells, so the cells are connected, able to communicate, linked together, but perhaps not in such a tight way. Now, the anchor proteins that connect the desmosomes to the cytoskeleton are quite various, and again, not going to go into these in too much detail, but again, we can see here are the cadherins in the middle. That's the cadherins there, and we can see the plaque that we have here in red. We have placoglobin, we have placophilin, which is linking to helping to form that plaque, and then we also have desmoplakin, which is this connecting protein, and these squiggles running off in the distance here are all the intermediate fiber network. So I'm not expecting you to know that, just understand that there are various proteins involved in these connections. The final major type of connection between cells are gap junctions, and these are slightly different because gap junctions are actually essentially channels between two cell types formed of connexin proteins. So what's happening here, instead of binding and stitching the cells together, what's actually happening is that the cytoplasms of the two neighboring cells are now directly joined. We have a channel in between the two cells. Yeah, so we're getting the cytoplasm is joined together on both sides. Now, the main functions of gap junctions allow cells to exchange metabolites, communication signals, but as well as that, because they form large plaques of these gap junctions, of these connexin structures forming the gap junctions tend to be in plaques, they also help cause adhesion between the cells, but they also have other roles, including things like suppressing tumor growth and allowing that communication. So this is one of the major ways that cells can communicate with their neighbors. And again, many cell types rely on these gap junctional communication to send signals through a tissue. So the first summary of the first 3 lectures is we've talked about the cytoskeleton and the role that the dynamic cytoskeleton, or the cytoskeleton, has a role in structure and shape, but it's dynamic. It also helps provide movement and also aids in tissue connections. And of course, cells in a tissue, in an organ, are connected. They can connect via the cytoskeleton directly by fusion, which helps, of course, the structural integrity of the cells. A good example of that are skeletal muscle cells, but most cells actually connect to each other by cell-to-cell junctions, and that provides both structure and communication between the cells, because the signals can be transmitted through those communication anchor points.